All right. So to introduce our speakers tonight, we have several speakers who share a passion for rivers. We're blessed to have the Androscoggin River right in our backyard. It has not always been as clean as it is today, but because of its somewhat, I guess, inauspicious past, it has many miles of undeveloped shoreline today that can make some sections feel pretty remote, such as the section above the Brunswick-Topsham Dam. And you can experience that remoteness by canoe, or if you haven't been to BTLT's Androscoggin Woods property off of Route 196, that's a really neat way to experience it. We'll learn more about the river's ecology tonight, including the role that dams play in river health. And our guides will be Charlie Spies, John Lichter, and Chuck Verrill. So Charlie is a 40-year resident of Brunswick-Topsham who has a strong interest in the ecological health of the Androscoggin River. He's a past board member of the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust and currently serves on its investment committee. He also serves on the research and advocacy committee of the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay and is on the board of the Merrymeeting Bay chapter of Trout Unlimited. He holds a master's degree in forest biology. And while semi-retired, he's still active professionally as president of CEI Bulos Capital Management. And I should add that Charlie lives on the river and spends time looking at it, or probably in it or on it just about every day, except in the winter.
It's true. That's true.
And John Lichter is a retired professor of biology and environmental studies at Bowdoin, and he continues to do research on the river. I sent a link, I think with the reminder today, to a previous program he did on some recent research he's done on fish populations around the Brunswick-Topsham Dam. And he is a current member of BTLT's board. And Chuck Verrill is a native of Maine who practiced international investment law in Washington for many years before returning home to Maine. He's a passionate fly fisherman. He is president of Maine Rivers and one of the counsel as in lawyer, attorney, for the Kennebec Coalition that is engaged in legal processes that are underway to restore Atlantic salmon, a federally designated endangered species in the Kennebec River. And he and his wife live in Brunswick. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Charlie.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. All right, great. Yeah, thank you, Caroline, for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with my two colleagues, John and Chuck. I also want to thank Susan Ray Reeves, who helped pull this together several months ago and really helped think through how to structure this tonight. We're going to cover, kind of weave together the history of the use of the river, some science around the ecology of the river, and policy decisions that have been made and could be made that'll affect the health of the river going forward. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth among these things, and just like any river ecosystem, they are entwined. I also want to take a moment to just thank Steve Hines, who is he follows all of the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensings around the state for the Maine chapter of Trout Unlimited. And it's a very, I'm trying to just figure out one dam here, and Steve does 52 of them. So I've learned a lot from him, and just wanted to reach out and say thank you. Let's see. Tonight, as mentioned, it's myself, it's John and Chuck, and we've already been introduced, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I do want to note that all the pictures you're going to see tonight, Caroline's right, I live on the river, right across from Pinette's Landing, and every photo that you see tonight is taken between the dam and the old railroad bridge. So within half a mile in the heart of Topsham, Brunswick suburb here, or urban area, however you want to define it. So this is all happening right here in our backyard, but it's only one small stretch of an amazing river. So what are we here for tonight, and what are we thinking about? As I mentioned, we're going to weave together several different themes. and tie them into how we might be helpful as a public voice going forward for the sake of this great resource. So the Androscoggin is a beautiful river. It's Maine's third largest river. It drains over 3,000 miles. It's 178 miles long. And just recently in 2022, it was reclassified from a Class C to a Class B river by Maine Water Quality Standards, which is an upgrade. And we need to thank Ed Friedman and the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay for over 2 decades of water quality analysis that was certified by the DEP as qualified, and allowed the Maine Board of Environmental Protection, as well as the legislature and the governor, to sign off on this upgrade that showed that the river was really higher than it had been classified. And that's important for 2 reasons. One is it lets people know about the quality of the river. For example, Class B is swimmable and fishable, and you can recreate there without a problem. But it also holds anybody who is introducing effluent or working anything, recreating anything on the river to meet those standards. So it protects the river going forward. This geographically is what the river does in terms of its drainage in Maine. If you look up to the right, that gray area, that's the watershed drainage for the river. Great Falls is where we are in Brunswick. That was the name of that stretch before, you start thinking about the Brunswick Dam here. Up to Lewiston, that green line is the Little Androscoggin River. And then the yellow line flows all the way up out into New Hampshire and back in again by the Rangeley Lakes, Ziskahas, and the Galloway. Big river, a lot of potential, and a very important economic driver in our state. And as I mentioned earlier, the Androscoggin River is a public resource. So as we have folks smelt fishing below the old paper mill, right below the Green Bridge. Some wonderful plants that are very, they're tied to this intertidal stretch of the river here, and very interesting. This guy is a winter stonefly. They emerge in March right along the edge of the river very often while these folks are out here fishing. They actually have antifreeze in their blood, and they come up and they avoid predators by emerging in the winter, but they're also a big food source under the ice. So that's something that's going on. Here we have a striped bass caught right below the Green Bridge. And this beaver I took a picture of in the spring right at Pinette's Landing. They show up before everything greens up, and they eat the roots and the tubers along the bank. So if you're careful, you can get a look at them. But all this stuff is happening right in town. This is the dam layout as it stands now. Looking at it from the Topsham side, Fort Andros, Cabot Mills. Here's the power plant, the fishway that you're all familiar with if you've gone across the Green Bridge, the dams themselves, and then there's a couple large gates to the right. I've identified Shad Island here because it'll be important in the next couple slides. I wanted to show you on some of the history of the use of the river here. So in the early 1900s, this is right below the falls. It's near where, if you know Water Street, where Industry Road comes in, where the public municipal garage is, where the towers. And these folks built a slide. They were out on the ice. They actually ran power out and had a rink out there. And it's really quite amazing what was happening. And there's someone with a set of skis. Just downstream from that, I think probably earlier, refrigeration came in the 1920s big time, but right across from Pinette's Landing above the railroad bridge, they were harvesting ice, and it was a big part of the economy here. And there was actually an ice house on the river along Water Street. This is a picture of why Shad Island is relevant. This was a power plant that was built on Shad Island in 1892. And what we're looking at is from the Brunswick side, probably about where the Green Bridge attaches to shore. This is a 300-foot walkway that took the folks out to the power plant to help run it. It was a 600 horsepower power plant, which is equal to probably 3 SUVs these days. Not a lot of power. And they did say to the builder, but it was the first one, and they did say, Shad Island's not a good place to be because it may come out in a spring freshet or a flood. And it did in 1927. So we know that this photo was taken before 1927. But what I wanted to point out here is a fishway. This is on the Topsham side, and clearly there was a concern about fish passage even back then. somewhere around the turn of the century, 1900. And you can see where barriers have been put in to force water over towards the mill and the power plant. And there was a concern about fish. And John is going to get into that a little bit in a few minutes. So today there's a very diverse wildlife along the river. This is Pinette's Landing, and I was walking by and saw these feet sticking up. I think someone doing yoga, and I said, boy, that looks almost like flowers. And it's not quite, but it was an interesting sight. These snapping turtles, they'll show up every Mother's Day, just about, and right in Pinette's Landing again, especially on a rainy day, and they're laying their eggs, which will emerge, and usually around September, head back into the river. So this is an eagle being harassed by crows or vice versa, and you can see this log here that came down on a freshet. That's in that same picture there, and now it's really more or less a park bench at the landing along the Water Street Road there. So we'll talk a little bit more about geology and specific, geography and specific segments of the river and how that affects or how important they are to fish. Below the dam, historically, below Brunswick, we had short-nosed sturgeon, Atlantic rainbow smelt, and Atlantic tomcod all running up to breed as anadromous fish, but they didn't go above the dam. They're still there. Their numbers have changed, as you'll see. They're still there. Heading above the dam were alewife, American shad, blueback herring, striped bass, and sea lamprey. And you might hear the term river herring used, and that includes blueback and alewife because they're very hard to separate. But they all went above the dam historically, all the way as far as Lewiston Falls and Biscoe Falls on the Little Androscoggin River. And then the really strong swimming and jumping Atlantic salmon went all the way up to Rumford and up the Little Androscoggin as far as Norway. American eels can go around structures in the right conditions, and they just keep on going. So diverse animals that are moving up and out of the ocean or back to the ocean to breed, very important in terms of transport of nutrients. So this is a lower part of the river. Again, here's Brunswick. And I wanted to just define these reaches for you. From Brunswick down is tidal. And in Brunswick, we have a dam. In Pejepscot, we have a dam. And up in Marumbo, which is Lisbon Falls, there's that dam there. And those are the first major barriers to fish passage in the lower Androscoggin. There are other barriers in the Sabattis River and also in Little Androscoggin that we'll get to, but we're kind of at the head of all those barriers right now. So if you think about the yellow line you just looked at, in 2017, Maine's Department of Marine Fisheries did a study and said if you could open up that yellow line section to make it fully available to these fish, then you could generate 387,000 alewives in a year, 84,000 shad, 730,000 blueback herring, and 182 Atlantic salmon. If you could also open up the Sabattis River drainage, then you really start to pile on with the alewives at 500,000, blueback herring at 40,000, and 29 Atlantic salmon. And then if you can get up to Lewiston and open up the passages to the Little Androscoggin River, not going way up to Rumford or any of that, you could actually have almost 1.7 million alewives, 37,000 more shad, and significantly more blueback herring and Atlantic salmon. So those are the potentials. And what I'm showing in this slide here is if you took all the numbers on the last slide and added up the blueback herring, the river herring and the American shad, if you opened up all that habitat, this is what potentially you could get. This is what has been measured going through the Brunswick Fishway during these years. And in the best year for herring, 179,000 went through, but that's only under 5% of what the potential is. In the best year for shad, 1,000, that's under 1% of the potential. And the same thing for Atlantic salmon. They've never had a year where they got above 1%. Maybe in 2022, they did, I think 18 salmon went through, and I haven't done the math on that, but regardless, it's de minimis compared to what the potential is. So that's what could happen if fishways were improved. And Chuck will show you examples of what happens when you do improve a fishway. Just quickly, these three dams on the lower Androscoggin generate 19, 16, and 19 megawatts respectively. They generate 21% of the total hydro production on the Andro, and a big part in the affected area that we're talking about. There's no hydro on the other river, Sabattis, I should say, and very little on the Little Androscoggin. But they are important, and in terms of energy production. So one of the things that has to be balanced by Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Wildlife Department of Marine Resources and others is they're required by law to balance the economic as well as the biological considerations here. So this is going to be all part of the mix during relicensing. Oops, sorry, this one always gets me. All right, so why are we here again tonight? To reiterate, as Caroline said, the Clean Water Act is 50 years old. This river was the impetus for Ed Muskie to create the Clean Water Act, and it has benefited tremendously. The FERC relicensing for the dams that we're talking about is on a 30 to 50 year cycle. So we really have a once in a generation opportunity here to work on the Brunswick Dam and others. The Brunswick Dam begins its licensing next year in 2024 with a 2029 deadline, although very often these things run over. So it's a complicated, long process, but it's not too early to get started. These dams were licensed back in the 80s, and we've learned a lot since then. As a matter of fact, the Pejepscot Mill, where the Sea Dog is now, was still processing paper in 1985. Current fishways exist, but as we just saw, they don't work well. And so we've got some major barriers to these anadromous, catadromous fish. This is very busy, but my point, it kind of gets back to what I said. It needs the decisions by FERC and others need to be balanced among many competing concerns. So I'm going to stop here, turn it over to John to talk about the ecology of the river, and return then with Chuck for some of his experience, and then we'll go to a wrap up. So I need to stop sharing, don't I, John? Okay, here we go. Okay.
John, remember to unmute yourself.
All right, you look like you're unmuted.
Okay, is that better? Sorry about that. And people can hear me?
Can hear you. You're not. Oh, there you go. You're in projection mode now. Perfect.
Okay. Well, I'd like to begin by thinking about the regional ecology of our rivers, estuary, and coastal ecosystems, and then focus in on the Androscoggin. I think starting with the broad view will show the importance and ecological potential of our river. First, this is a simplified food web for the Northwest Atlantic. You see numerous species and groups of species with lines showing the connections among them. It's more or less showing who eats whom. And a few points about this food web. Again, it's simplified. Many of these boxes are groups of species, not individual species. Notice that cod is prominent. The original ecosystem was dominated by cod. They were phenomenally abundant. Millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of fish were out there in the Gulf of Maine. Also notice that this system is just entirely complex. As a scientific subject, it's daunting to have a real good a complete understanding of this would be really not feasible. The best we can do is just to hope to get the big pieces of it right. That said, Native peoples intuitively understood much about the complexity and connectivity of the natural world. They observed it every day and depended on it every day. John Muir perhaps best described this complexity with this quote, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. Now, this original ecosystem was resilient to change, to climate change and to other natural disturbances. Because of its the diversity of species, the large population size of different species, and the high reproductive capacity of many species, and also the many connections of them. So by resilient, I mean bend but not break. It's not that the system wouldn't change, it would flex with change or with disturbance and then bounce back. I first started thinking about the marine ecosystems after meeting this guy, Ted Ames. Ted was a commercial cod fisherman and lobsterman. He was also a teacher, and he became a scientist later in life. And what he did was, he had experienced the cod collapse of the fishery 3 times during his lifetime. And he wanted to understand that better. And so he started building on the work of people who had gone earlier, where they had talked to fishermen to understand where they were fishing, what they were catching, how they fished, where the spawning grounds were, and so forth. And to map those fishing grounds. In 2005, Ted received a MacArthur Genius Award for his work, which was reconstructing cod movement patterns among these many fishing grounds in the Gulf of Maine. Okay, so we're just showing basically our area here, but from here to the Bay of Fundy, there were well over 450 small fishing grounds. I met Ted and we began to collaborate, and we and Bowdoin students helped quite a bit. We helped Ted with a lot of the computer mapping and also some of the statistical analyses that he needed. And so one of the things we did was construct this changes in the fisheries in the Gulf of Maine, going back to the 1860s when there's some good data to the present day. What you see is there were, again, many, many small fishing grounds in coastal waters and some larger fishing grounds offshore. That's in 1860. In 2000, we see that all of these coastal fishing grounds were extirpated by that time. Many of them was in the 1880s, still in the age of sail when this happened. So this isn't actually a modern industrial ship kind of fishing problem. This has happened before that, much of it did. And so you may say, well, sure, it's overfishing. That's not that hard to understand. People will go to the easiest places, the nearest places, and catch the fish there, and then they'll only go out further when they have to. And this is true, but it's not the whole story. And in fact, we had quite a mystery there that we've begun to unravel. These data are from a tagging study from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, which was conducted in the early 2000s. And what you see here is in the Gulf of Maine, where the yellow squares are, juvenile cod were released that had tags on them. More than 114,000 juvenile cod were released where you see the yellow squares, and they were recaptured again where you see the red dots. And so actually we could draw a line where each cod was put in and where it went to, but it makes this very busy. Anyway, what you see is sort of a pattern like we saw with the extirpation of the small fishing grounds. If I back up one, there's no active fishing grounds at all along much of the coast of Maine. And it turns out that juvenile cod are not hanging around there. So it's not fishing pressure, because if it were, there is no fishing pressure. For some reason, these fish are not staying there. They're boating with their feet and getting back out of town. Well, the issue is why. There's plenty of food there. Cod eat just about everything. And you all know there's plenty of lobster in between our area and Eastport. But it turns out that lobster and other things are not good food for juvenile cod. They need small fish. In a way, it's they need their omega-3s just like we do, in a way. or they won't grow to maturity and reproduce themselves. And so what happened to the small fish? Well, that's where the connection to the rivers came in. And so Ted, when I met him, he really had this idea that the cod populations were intimately connected to the major rivers. And by that, he even includes the Damascotta and the Metawak and so on, the Machias. And so there were several subpopulations of cod connected to the rivers. The hypothesis being that they depended on the anadromous fish coming into spawn, and more importantly, their young of year leaving the rivers. This was actually known in the 19th century. This is Spencer Baird, the Commissioner of Fisheries in 1873, and I quote, "The general conclusions which have been reached as a result of repeated conversations with Captain Treat and other fishermen on the coast incline me to believe that the reduction in cod and other fisheries so as to become practically a failure is due to the decrease off our coast of the quantity primarily of alewives and secondarily of shad and salmon more than to any other cause." Well, this understanding, this knowledge was lost throughout much of the 20th century, and we are just rediscovering it now. Under the heading of "A picture is worth 1,000 words," here's a picture by Heather Perry, Alewives Meet Dam. And so why is it that we've lost these species? Sure, there was overfishing early on, even in the 18th century, certainly in the 19th century. There was overfishing. There was certainly water pollution in the 19th and 20th centuries, just terrible water pollution. But basically the dams were constructed by across the major rivers, were completed by the Civil War. And so it is probably not a coincidence that these cod fisheries collapsed in the 1880s, just soon after the construction of these major dams. Dams affect all aspects of river ecology. Ecologically, or from the fish's point of view, dam removal is always the best solution. Another 19th century insight, this one from a Canadian geologist, Henry Yule Hind, in 1877. And I quote, "The relation of the deep sea commercial fishes is intimately connected with the condition of coastal waters as feeding and breeding grounds, as nurseries for bait, nurseries for young fry, for spawning, hatching, and feeding grounds. So intimate is this relation that the abundance or poverty of many deep sea fisheries is measured by the preservation of these natural nurseries in their original state." That you could not today better describe ecosystem thinking or the theme of ecosystem management and so forth than Hind did in 1877. That's 60 years before the word ecosystem was even coined. And so this guy was at least 100 years ahead of his time. Now, to get this point across, this is a air-sonar imagery that I'm going to show, taken by one of our students, Simi Harrison, several years ago. And what you're looking at is basically the footprint of a sonar looking out at Nequasset Lake, a few meters. This is a rock on the bottom, and you probably see the shallowness of this lake here. Now, what you're going to see is these are juvenile alewives schooling paths. These fish are an inch and a half long at most, and they are the prey. And here come the predators. Again, the point being, these fish convert zooplankton to fish tissue, which everything else eats. And so they're a keystone species for the riverine, the estuary, and the coastal ecosystems. This is the fish run at Damascotta Mills. They pass, since fixing the fish ladder there, they pass 1 million fish each year. And there's a harvest. If we think about the Kennebec Androscoggin system, a modern study reconstructed how many alewives would have returned every year based on lake area. And originally it was 18 to 20 million alewives would have returned to the Kennebec and 4.5 million to the Androscoggin. Each female carries roughly 125,000 eggs. That would be 1.4 trillion eggs deposited in lakes, ponds, and streams each and every year, decade after decade, century after century. That's a lot of eggs. Sure, everything eats them. That's the point. But even if 1% of that 1.4 trillion eggs made it to a hatchling, a small fish hatchling, a fingerling, young of year fish, that's 14 billion young of year fish coming out of the Androscoggin Kennebec system every single year and moving into the coastal waters. Okay, that's why the Gulf of Maine was so bountiful and had so many cod, because of our rivers. Okay, now let's look at the Brunswick-Topsham situation. We have 11 years here going back to 2011, salmon, shad, and river herring. I'll start with shad. Over in 3 different years, we've done shad surveys with the Department of Marine Resources, the Androscoggin River Alliance, and the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. And in these surveys, we know how many shad get up the ladder because they're counted up there. We want to know how many are below the dam trying to get up the ladder. And in each of these years, in one tidal cycle, we counted over 5,000 shad moving towards the fish ladder. That's in a single tidal cycle. So there's at least 5,000 fish down there trying to get up the ladder. However, on average, only 79 shad made it in each of these years. That's 1.6% success. Not great. If we look at salmon, it looks to me like salmon are barely hanging on at all. It's not working well for shad. You might think, well, it works for, most people think it works well for the river herring. This averages out to 79,000 a year, up to almost 1 million over 11 years. But remember that the Damariscotta fish ladder is passing 1 million each year. And that fish ladder has places where it's only 6 feet wide. The Androscoggin River is the 3rd largest river in Maine, and we can't, we're not even close to this one lake, basically, in coastal Maine. So it looks to me like we're just not doing that well for fish on the Androscoggin, or this fish ladder isn't. Okay, last point, couple points about ecological recovery. This is one of the sulfite mill dams or mills that was built up at Rumford on the Androscoggin. That was in 1895. They dumped their effluent straight into the river, as did all municipalities, just dumped their raw sewage right into the river until the Clean Water Act. What you see here, this is dissolved oxygen concentration. In 1931, there was an engineering report, and here it was already at 5 parts per million. This is already too low for salmon and probably other species. And what we're looking at here is the collapse from 31 to 1965. This is showing the collapse of the system. At 0 summertime oxygen, there's nothing alive except for a few species of anaerobic bacteria. Now this recovery, very quick, dramatic recovery, is due to the Clean Water Act. So if you're not dumping the raw sewage right in the river, you're making it go through a wastewater treatment where it has to decompose somewhere other than the river, doesn't consume the oxygen there. So thank you, Edmund Muskie. It was a great success. This allowed ecological recovery of the river systems. And so let's look at an ecological property or biological property. This is submerged aquatic vegetation in Merrymeeting Bay. This is the photo is of eelgrass, but it's illustrating the same kind of plant. So in Merrymeeting Bay in freshwater, we have tape grass, which looks very similar and does the same thing. It provides nursery habitat for many, many species. Okay, it's it is the keystone species in Merrymeeting Bay and the river systems. And so we see the collapse of this also when the water was so filthy. So it's essentially the water got so cloudy, so filthy that there wasn't enough light penetrating for the vegetation to photosynthesize. With the Clean Water Act in the 70s, we see a more gradual recovery where this kind of the chemical property over here recovered quickly, but the ecological property is taking longer. But after perhaps 3 decades, this stuff is roaring back now. And this is an encouraging thought. We all know about tipping points where if we push an ecosystem or push the climate system, for instance, too far, as we're pushing it, we don't actually see much change until we pass some threshold, and then there's rapid change, and it's very difficult to get it out of that point. The same thing, the same dynamic can happen in complex systems going the other direction. So this system was completely degraded, and it starts back slowly, but it passed some threshold where the plants are recruiting much faster. And as they come back, so does the food web that the fish depend on. Okay, a few summary comments, and I'll hand this off to Chuck. First, ecosystems are extremely complex with numerous links among species and spatial connections across regions. This thing is so complex that we cannot possibly know what the long-term consequences will be of altering this thing in any way. This is a lesson people never actually learn until it's too late. We cannot, also, I'm stipulating, we cannot know for sure if these species will or will not be able to adapt to warming of the future. Therefore, the best we can do is to aid the recovery of native species and then just get out of the way. Nature will sort itself out after that. We probably won't end up with something that resembled the system in 1600, but we'll end up with a functioning ecosystem, and that's what's important. Lastly, I think the resilience of human communities in many ways depends on the functioning and resilient ecosystems. And I'll leave that. This is an example of what all of our rivers in Maine should look like, and to the extent that they do, we have people like Chuck Verrill, who's following me now, to thank for this, and others who have made the effort so far to contribute to river restoration on our rivers. Thanks.
Oh, thanks, John. If you could let me share.
So I think I killed that.
Yep. Oops. Yeah, okay. All right, I'm trying to advance. There we go. All right, so turning it over to Chuck Verrill now, and this slide is just another shot of the river from a long time ago. As noted earlier, Chuck has experience both in litigating and arguing about FERC relicensing, as well as seeing success when you actually do move some dams. So Chuck, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you too, John, for emphasizing the importance of alewives. And I've entitled my paper, "Maine Dams Range from Big to Small and Are Often Bad." And I think the fact that dams retard the growth of alewives is something that I will address a little more thoroughly in the rest of this paper. Maine has a vast number of dams on its rivers and streams. They range from giants like the Wyman Project on the Kennebec River to scores of small dams, such as the earthen structure that impounds Mere Brook behind Maine Pines Tennis Club in Brunswick. You can see from this slide how many dams there are in the state of Maine. The hundreds of smaller dams in Maine which do not produce electricity almost always lack facilities to pass migratory fish such as alewives, shad, and eels. The dam on Mere Brook blocks upstream passage of salters, wild brook trout that spend time in the ocean but return to freshwater to spawn in the spring. At the other end of the spectrum are the hydroelectric dams that are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. There are 109 FERC-registered dams in Maine, including the Androscoggin River Dam here in Brunswick. While the dam in Brunswick has a fishway, it is antiquated and blocks the majority of fish from passing upstream to spawn. Regrettably, a number of other FERC-regulated dams have no fishways at all. More than half of the FERC-licensed dams in Maine, including the Brunswick Dam, are owned by Brookfield Corporation, a holding company based in Toronto. Brookfield has over $725 billion worth of alternative energy assets under management. Brookfield is also one of the largest dam owners in the world. Brookfield has the resources to retain squadrons of lawyers and lobbyists to aggressively protect its hydro assets here in Maine and elsewhere. Brookfield does not hesitate to deploy these squadrons before state and federal regulators. Unfortunately, outsized capacity to protect hydro assets is often out of sync with the public interest in restoring the ecological values of Maine's waters. The construction of dams in Maine of all sizes has come at a cost. As Professor Lichter's presentation shows, Maine's freshwater fisheries are a shadow of what they were when colonists arrived here several hundred years ago. There's still a lot of good fishing in this state, and I take advantage of it whenever I can. But imagine what it was like before dams, many of which were built to power now idle mills that no longer have any use. It's a shame that many of those useless dams continue to adversely impact fish populations. This is the context that inspired Bill Townsend, a Waterville lawyer and passionate fly fisherman, to establish Maine Rivers as a nonprofit corporation in 2002. The Maine Rivers bylaws state that the purpose of Maine Rivers is to protect, restore, and enhance the ecological health of Maine's river systems. Bill envisioned that Maine Rivers would be the voice for Maine Rivers. Maine Rivers is not a large organization. It has a full-time executive director, a part-time engineer, and an active board of directors. That's Bill right there. I am its president and pro bono counsel in numerous regulatory proceedings. Phil Townsend was also inspired by the effectiveness of citizen advocacy for Maine's rivers, which in 1998 resulted in the removal of the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Augusta. The removal of this dam, which had blocked migratory fish from reaching a vast watershed, was a product of robust advocacy by the Kennebec Coalition, a dedicated group of environmental organizations. Soon after the Edwards success, those organizations won the legal battles that led to the removal of the Fort Halifax Dam, which blocked fish passage and migration up the Sebastopol River, a major tributary which joined the Kennebec River just below Waterville. The result of these two dam removals was a dramatic and inspiring illustration of the resiliency of migratory fish when obstacles to migration are removed. Within a year, millions of alewives were able to swim past up to Kennebec, past the site of the old Edwards Dam, and then up to the vast Sebastopol into a vast watershed to spawn. It was a miracle that the alewives in such numbers migrated up those rivers to spawning grounds that were open for the first time in over 200 years. Now, the removal of the Fort Halifax Dam also provided a restoration opportunity for Maine rivers, And this is sort of summarized in a chart on the left, but let me go through it a little more detail. Outlet Stream is a small waterway that connects China Lake to the Sebastopol River. Alewives had long been stocked in China Lake by Maine's Department of Marine Resources. The offspring of these stocked alewives left in the fall by swimming down Outlet Stream, plunging over dams when necessary, on their way to the Sebastopol. However, there was no way for those alewives to return to China Lake to spawn, even after the removal of the Edwards and Fort Halifax dams, because 6 rustic dams from colonial times blocked their return up Outlet Stream. These were not big dams. I think the next slide may show that. No, not quite. These were not big dams. Outlet Stream is only a few, there we go. Outlet Stream is only a few yards wide in most places, and some of the dams were simply piles of rocks. Others were, as shown in this slide, built to support the mill that was adjacent to it.
Oh, okay, sorry. There we go.
There we go. But despite their simplicity, these dams were an effective barrier to inbound alewife migration. Alewives could survive plunging over those dams in the fall, but when swimming upstream against a current in the spring, those dams are an impassable barrier. To remove those dams, Maine Rivers' Executive Director Landis Hudson and a part-time assistant, together with a DMR biologist who lived near the Outlet Stream, agreed to take on the task of removing the 6 dams that prevented alewives from migrating into China Lake. Over 6 years, the team managed to convince the owner of 3 of the dams to permit their removal without cost to the owner. These are the 3 principals in the restoration effort, Landis on the left, and then the other 2 people who assisted in the removal effort. Now, over 6 years, the team managed to convince the owner of 3 of the dams to permit their removal without cost to the owner. Often, the team had to persuade the owner that they would not miss the impoundment after the dam removal, not always an easy sell. Owners were also assured that the team would plant vegetation on stream banks exposed as the dam impoundment was drawn down. Removal was not feasible at the other 3 dams for practical reasons that could not be overcome. At those sites, the team constructed modern fishways, which allowed alewives to bypass the dam. One of these alewives is the one you see on this, one of these dams rather, and fishways is the fishway that was built which was essential to maintain water levels of China Lake. At another dam, a fishway was constructed to maintain an impoundment which had a center sandy beach and was the center of a popular local park. Here, the owner refused to even talk about removal, but readily agreed to a fishway. Without those compromises, local support for the overall project would have vanished. In fact, throughout this restoration project, Landis and her team of restoration partners recognized the need for local support for the project to proceed. For example, they attended countless town meetings to explain the project and its value to the town. They spoke at the project at local schools, and school children were engaged to participate in the vegetation of newly exposed riparian land following land dam removal. This is a photograph of flowers that were planted by school children as part of a project that was undertaken in one of the local schools under the inspiration of Maine Rivers. Finally, Landis and the team were able to obtain the funds necessary to finance the project from state, federal, and private donors. This spring, alewives were able to access China Lake for the first time in hundreds of rivers. What guided those alewives at their migration up the Kennebec, then up the Sebastopol, and finally up Outlet Stream to China Lake remains a mystery to me. but thank heavens it happened. Concurrently with the China Lake project, Maine Rivers joined another restoration project getting underway on the Kennebec River. The removal of Edwards Dam was a game-changing success and a model for river advocacy, but it only opened up a short section of the Kennebec River from here up to here to Atlantic salmon, an endangered species that lives much of its life in the ocean, but migrates into fresh water to span. Beyond that stretch, 4 major dams, each owned by Brookfield, continued to block Atlantic salmon from swimming up the Kennebec to the Sandy River near Farmington, which is way up here. This was a major obstacle to the recovery of Atlantic salmon populations. The Sandy River has clear, cool water and a sandy bottom that is ideal for salmon nesting and is one of the best salmon spawning habitats in Maine. Recognize the importance of the Sandy River to the recovery of the Atlantic salmon, Maine DMR operates a fish reef at the Lockwood Dam in Waterville. At the first remaining dam upriver from the Edwards site. The Lockwood fish trap captures salmon during the impound migration and ships them by truck to the Sandy River where they spawn. The natural spawn at the Sandy River, supplemented by stocking of salmon eggs from state hatcheries, produces a significant hatch of young salmon each year. During the outbound migration, the young salmon spawned into Sandy, as well as adult salmon shipped from the fish lift at Rockwood, have to pass a potentially fatal gauntlet of hydro turbines at the 4 remaining downriver dams before reaching clear passage to the ocean. 7 years ago, the FERC license for the Shawmut Dam in Fairfield came up for renewal. This presented an opportunity for river advocates to press FERC to impose license conditions in the renewal license that would facilitate safe passage for salmon and other migratory fish, or even better, to convince FERC to order removal of the dam. To take advantage of this opportunity, Maine Rivers joined the Natural Resources Council of Maine, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, and Trout Unlimited in a revival of the Kennebec Coalition. The coalition, joined by the Conservation Law Foundation, timely filed motions to intervene as parties in the Shawmut license renewal proceedings at FERC. At the outset, Intervenors Council determined that it would be important to convince FERC that the environmental analysis that its staff would conduct early in the proceeding should consider the combined and cumulative effect of migratory fish of the necessity to pass 4 dams, not just Shawmut, on the way down up to the Sandy River. Now, under federal law, the FERC environmental analysis is required to determine if conditions to the renewal application are necessary to avoid adverse environmental effects, including the impact of migratory fish. An environmental analysis that cumulated the impact of fish passing all 4 dams would be especially helpful because any conditions that were imposed and found necessary to protect fish at Shawmut would also be made applicable to the 3 dams whose licenses are not up for renewal. Now, FERC agreed to conduct a cumulative environmental analysis and even accepted the coalition request that FERC conduct a more elaborate environmental impact analysis. We now expect FERC to issue the draft EIS in August. This will give us the opportunity to insist on strong measures to protect migrating fish, including salmon, and particularly to urge dam removal. Now, concurrently with the environmental analysis by FERC, the presence of endangered Atlantic salmon requires a review of the Shawmut renewal application under procedures mandated by the Endangered Species Act. Before covering those procedures, I note they will also be applicable during the relicensing of the Brunswick Dam, when renewal proceedings begin in a couple of years, because a normal number of Atlantic salmon pass the decrepit fishway beside Fort Andros.
Hey, Chuck, I just want to let you know we're at 8 o'clock, so we're working down our way down.
Very good. I'll be very brief for the remainder. Now, before FERC can approve a license application involving an endangered species, the provision in the application specifically focused on protection of that species must be reviewed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in consultation with the applicant here, Brookfield. This consultation is focused on the plans in the Brookfield license renewal application for the protection of Atlantic salmon and 3 other dams. Such measures can include, for example, limited operation of the dam turbines during migration season. NOAA has now examined the Brookfield proposals for fish protection and has issued what is called a biological impact analysis. And that was issued on March 20, 1923. Yes, in 2023, I'm sorry, I missed a century. It is a long 287 pages of single-space findings and analysis, which for the most part is favorable to Brookfield. The BIOP finds that the Shawmut relicensing and the implementation of the final species protection plan may adversely affect, but not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of Atlantic salmon, and are not likely to adversely destroy or modify critical habitat. The Kennebec Coalition has challenged the findings of the BIOP as deeply flawed, and has proceeded that the species protection plan measures proposed by Brookfield will not prevent the extirpation of Atlantic salmon in the Kennebec critical habitat. They note that experts like Professor John Waldman, quote, are unaware of any successful Atlantic salmon restoration initiatives where salmon must pass through 4 dams. Despite the NOAA BIOP, the ballgame is not over. FERC could still conclude that the EIS would justify more robust regulatory action than mandated by the BIOP. Interested parties, such as a coalition, can request FERC to reconsider any final order adopting the Special Species Protection Plan as approved by NOAA. And if the request is denied, an appeal can be taken to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, Maine Rivers and the coalition, recalling that difficult roadblocks were overcome before the Edwards Dam was finally removed, are determined to continue the battle to gain safe passage for Atlantic salmon to and from the Sandy River and the survival of that splendid species. And I'll stop there. I think I'm a little bit over my time limit, but I will conclude there.
All right, thanks, Chuck. And I think we said in the beginning we were going to weave together, history, the science around the biology and ecology of the river and its fishes, as well as the policy. And you can see that they are intertwined. They're very complex and a heavy lift. And it's great to have different parties forming these coalitions to work together, because as Chuck said, very often the hydropower facilities have a very sophisticated teams that can argue and lobby, and we need folks like John and Maine Rivers and Chuck to help wade through this and not be steamrolled, if you will. So this is a picture of another picture of the Brunswick Dam straight on. You see the fishway on the left. If you'll notice, there's a spout of water coming out at the bottom center there. That's the downstream fish passage in that dam. It's only 18 inches wide. So when fish are coming down the river, the alewives, salmon, others, they can either go through the turbines or if they're lucky, they end up going through the fishway. So we know, and it's been shown, I think, fairly well proven that both the upstream passage, that long one on the left, and the downstream fishway are inadequate. And that'll be something that needs to be considered in the upcoming relicensing of the Brunswick Dam. And that's just a closer shot of that downstream fishway. If you can see it from the Green Bridge at low tide anytime or lower tides. So a lot of people don't know what that is, but that's how the fish get by the turbines, which are all right here. Let me just see what I got next. There's just one more shot. And it goes without saying at this point, the FERC relicensing process is a heavy lift, but we have public input. That's where we get to be involved as citizens, either in a coalition or as individuals. And the more voices and the more separate voices, the more independent voices. FERC has said that the more independent voices they hear, not just a form letter from 5,000 people that you send out and click on the internet, really makes a difference to them. The licensees have the right to argue and try to minimize their costs, frankly. And then the federal agencies also have a huge responsibility relative to the laws that are tied into the relicensing, which include, as Chuck said, the the Endangered Species Act, the Maine Mammals Act, the Federal Power Act, and there's about 7 or 8 other ones that are involved. So getting back to the circle here, Thomas Purchas arrived in Brunswick, was in Brunswick then, in 1628. He was the first European to come here. He set up a trading post. As John said, the indigenous Wabanaki had been here for thousands of years and are much more focused on the interconnectedness of the ecosystem. Well, when the Europeans came, they looked for the resources in fish, and then they looked for the resources in energy, whether it was water power or electric power, built mills, and have affected the river incredibly. So after 400 years, can we look in the mirror and can we make things better? Can we improve the situation for the fish? And by doing that, use the science of Dr. Lichter and others to actually improve the economy in the Gulf of Maine through better populations of fish that are consumed, like cod, and a more healthy distribution of biomass up and down the rivers, in and out of the oceans, that you can with literally billions of fish. Is it time to do that? The river has come a long way, but we can certainly make things better. And we understand now, as Dr. Lichter said, dams are a big part of that. So I'm going to end really with this slide. I took this about 4 years ago, and I was amazed. Really was one of the things that piqued my interest in the river and its abundance of life. And these are all seagulls sitting on these rocks, or some mergansers over here. I'm sorry, cormorants. And they're eating alewives that are just all through here. And to see a seagull eat an 8-inch alewife is just something to see. Incomprehensible, really. But they were pulling them up and eating them. And I thought, what an abundant group, life here. This is wonderful. But the more I learned, the more I understood really what's going on here is one big log jam. These fish are coming upriver, as we saw in some earlier ones, and they're getting stuck below this dam. And while some of them get up, many, many, many don't. And I think it occurred to me that if you could open the dams up or remove them, you'd probably still see this, because in effect, you'd have relatively more fish going up, and you'd still have a lot of fish here, but you'd also have many, many more fish getting upstream. So what looks like abundance when you start to dig down is really not, it's more of a log jam, and that's something that can be resolved with proper relicensing. As John said, dam removal is always better. There's no getting around that. But can you have that happen in every case? That's an open question that needs to be considered over the next few years. And what can the science and the technology do to improve fishways one way or another? So what we are asking for folks that are interested here tonight is just kind of spread the word. People protect what they value. The more people know, the more they'll care. And the more people that use the river or around the river will care. So tell others about this resource, how clean it is. If you didn't know about the Class C to B upgrade, you do now. If you didn't know how effective the Clean Water Act has been right in your town, in the center of it, Brunswick and Topsham, now you do. FERC relicensing for this dam begins in 2024. It's going to be a long process and a heavy lift, but the first couple of years are very important in terms of input and letting our both federal and state legislators know that we care about this. So I welcome you to reach out to me. Here's my email. What I'm trying to do now as we get geared up is create a database of interested folks. Would love to build a coalition similar to the Kennebec Coalition with the help of people that know how to do it, like Chuck and others, and keep people informed as we go forward. While 2029, which is when the license is due to actually expire, seems a long way off. It's really not in the relicensing process. So we're going to end here. This is a picture of the old paper mill, which is now a brew pub and offices. And we often talk about jobs in the river and energy. Well, none of those jobs are there anymore. They're different jobs, and they're there because the river is a beautiful place. These are mergansers. They come here in the winter and they feed on the smelt that come up. And so there's open water and they're very happy, probably much to the chagrin of the downstream smelt fishermen. But that's just another example of how this river works all year, every year. Thank you very much. And I think right now we could stop and open it up to questions, Caroline, if there are any. And hope that you found some of the material is dense, but hope that you found it of value and see how this all ties together.
Thanks so much, Charlie and John and Chuck. I think the pictures really tell the story. Those beautiful pictures of eelgrass and a dense logjam of alewives. One just clarification for folks who might not be as up on fish ecology, but can one of you explain what anadromous fish are?
John, you're gonna do it justice. Go ahead.
No, anadromous fish simply means sea-run fish. They're fish that live in the ocean but come into the freshwater systems to spawn.
Great. And just before I dig into the question, one other thing that has really struck me, but I think, and you alluded to it, but if you could just elaborate a little bit on what you said about how fish moving up rivers do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of moving nutrients from the ocean up into inland areas. And can you just explain that a little bit more?
So I think Charlie mentioned that.
Yeah, well, the adult fish are bringing in nutrients from the ocean. In the case of Atlantic East Coast salmon, they don't die necessarily when they breed, but Western salmon do, and they leave a lot of nutrients up in the upper parts of these rivers. Lampreys, when they come into the river, do die, and they leave some nutrients. So there's differences between the species. If they're successful, the alewives and the shad will return. What happens, which is very important, is when, and again, John can expand on this tremendously, those young eggs turn into feeding fish. They're consuming a lot of, I think the correct term would be phosphates and other things that are in the water, and they're moving that out into the ocean, and they're providing a food source for cod and others. But John or Chuck, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll talk about phosphorus for sure. Phosphate and phosphorus is the main nutrient in lakes that give us the blue-green algal blooms. So it's a problem. The problem today, maybe originally it was not enough nutrients, so the fish brought nutrients into the watershed. But today it's too many nutrients in the watersheds. And there was a pretty amazing study done in the late 70s and early 80s on the Damariscotta Lake run. I'm blanking on this guy's name, but anyway, he published a paper in the mid-80s. He had basically captured in a trap the juveniles leaving Damariscotta Lake. He knew how many adults got up there, and he trapped the juveniles leaving. It was his, the last name was Walton anyway. And what he did was he basically trapped them and just weighed them and estimated how many there were. And so he knows how many are coming in, how many adults are coming in, how many are dying there, how many leave then, adults, and then the juveniles that leave. And so I just kind of went through and multiplied by the average weight of these little fingerling young of year fish, plus the average weight of adult fish. And they are exporting, basically there's about 8 times the fish tissue, the fish mass is leaving that lake than what died in it. And so those fish are exporting a lot of phosphorus, which is a problem in lakes. In other words, given time, they should clean up the lakes. And I think that's what's happened. You know, in some of the older lake, where some of the earlier introductions were done, like Weber Pond, for instance, off the Kennebec.
So in other words, in the absence of fish, phosphorus is staying in the ponds and creating the algal blooms.
Yeah, it doesn't go anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
some of it will get tied up in the sediments, but it's not like nitrogen, for instance, will go back to the atmosphere. It's there. Once it's there, it's there.
Got it. All right, so let's get to the questions. Jeff asked for a little bit more information about the difference between the 2 classifications. Charlie, you talked about how that the lower stem of the andro has been reclassified or upgraded to class B. So he's asking, what does it really mean scientifically? 5 to 7 parts per million dissolved oxygen is a measurement, but can it be more fully understood from an environmental perspective? What additional benefits will happen?
Well, as John indicated, if you go down below a certain level, say 5 parts per million, which is class C, you start to see mortality among species. And certain species need more oxygen than others, and they need cooler water. And other species, it may vary by age, where the young can do better in a low oxygen environment, but the adults that are coming into spawn can't. So it does make a difference, even 2 parts per million going from B to C on average. And then there's also a concentration figure. I think it goes from 75% oxygen to 85 or something along those lines. That makes a difference in the survival rate during the course of the year of these juveniles and adults in all species. And that's how you translate that from a number to success in terms of spawning and water quality in general. And the other thing to consider that the classification does is that dissolved oxygen. One of the concerns is, as we experience climate change and more warming, the necessity to meet the class B standards could result in higher flow rates coming out of these dams to keep oxygen levels up. They may have to do that. So they're going to be required to keep the water at that higher level of oxygenation than they would have otherwise had that regrading not been done. So I hope that answers that question.
I think it does.
Yeah.
Let me add just one point, that is that the class B classification means that anybody who makes a discharge into that water cannot, as a result of that discharge, lower the standards that are established for class B waters. So it's an important regulator of discharges into the water that is now classified under B.
All right, a question from Mary. Besides an owner refusing to allow dam removal, what other factors might render such removal impossible?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Some people might argue that there's things like flood control, those kinds of things. Dams have a mixed record in their ability to actually control floods. The dam in Brunswick is what's called run of the river. it does not actually impound water behind it. So it's not going to help you control a flood. It's simply going to let the water go through. But Chuck, do you know of other reasons other than owner resistance for thoughtful dam removal, for stopping thoughtful dam removal?
Well, as a practical matter, a lot of people who own property along the impoundments caused by dams are very reluctant to see that impoundment disappear if the dam is removed. Interestingly, there is a study that shows that by a Colby professor that shows that in properties along impoundments actually improve in value after that impoundment is lowered as a result of dam removal.
That's interesting. What about the downstream? I'm going to try to go quickly because we're coming up on 8:30 and I want to let people go. But Joe is asking, what about the downstream migration of young fish? Studies on salmon rivers out west show that at least 25% of the young are lost at each dam. With 4 dams remaining on the Kennebec, is it worth trying to save it?
Well, it is absolutely true that the downstream migration of salmon in particular is impaired by the turbines operation while they're swimming downriver. That, in fact, is one of the major focuses of the species protection plan that FERC and NOAA look at, and that involves, or requires rather, the owners of dams to restrict turbine operation during expected migration periods, to divert fish away from the turbines while they're in operation, and so forth. And one of the things we always work for as we're contesting a dam license renewal is the most stringent possible downstream protections to ensure fish survival when they go through turbines.
Yeah, they use the term entrainment, which is just a nice way of saying that the fish get eaten by the turbines. But
yeah, that's not good.
One thing that Steve points out in response to the question about what are the other reasons that prevent dam removal, Steve points out that dams in the upper parts of watersheds make for more even flow, and that is necessary for the function of things like receiving wastewater from municipal treatment plants, and towns losing property tax revenue if dams are removed. So a few other factors. Michelle wants to know what makes a good fish ladder.
It depends on who you ask. There are many people that would say that no fish ladder is a good fish ladder. Some work better for one species than another. So it's very hard to get a kind of a universally accepted fish ladder. For example, shad are very reluctant historically to use fish ladders. We have seen some examples of fish elevators, which are basically a lift that fish swim into, and they're used in Maine. Some of them are on timers and some are visual, where they'll actually move the fish up then over the dam and dump them down the other side or pump them into trucks to be moved. It may be that it makes sense to put a fish lift or it may be that the science says that a fish lift should occur in Brunswick at some point. We don't know the answer to that yet because the arguments haven't been made, but I certainly again would defer to my colleagues on that.
Another point in this connection is to locate our fish ladder so that fish are attracted to it during migration. And there are various ways that fish can be attracted to fish ladders, and that's an important part of the evaluation of every fish ladder proposal that is considered.
Just a couple of more questions, and there's some interesting comments in the chat if people want to take a look at that, but I'm focusing on the questions. is there data on temperature changes or other knock-on effects of climate change, such as saltwater intrusion into a rising water table, and the impact on water quality and therefore fish and other species?
I'm sure there's increasing temperatures in the rivers earlier and earlier spring and so on like that. I'm not sure about the saltwater intrusion.
All
It's
right.
also known that when there is an impoundment above a dam, where a dam is actually holding back and creating a lake-like structure, that you see temperature increases in those impoundments that wouldn't otherwise occur.
Right. Two more questions. One, has a really effective fish ladder been engineered and installed in a way that we can see as a model?
If you'd like to see a fish lift that works really well for the river herring, there's one in operation at Benton Falls, just off the side of the road. They pass as many as over 5 million alewives and blueback herring over the dam, and they're actually counted. So it works well for river herring. It doesn't work as well for shad. They're just don't want to go into the bucket. I don't know if they get salmon there or not, but I can't imagine that it would work well for salmon either. So if it was just the river herring, a fish lift would work well, pretty well anyway.
Another very, very effective fish ladder is the one at China Lake, which has just been installed and which is used for the first time this year by alewives. And it has functioned very much as we intended, and the alewife flow over the fishway has been extraordinary.
Great. So people have two things to check out in Benton Falls and China Lake. The last question is, if the dam in Brunswick were to not be renewed, would it be fully removed? And if so, would there be any adverse consequences? You just said that flooding wouldn't be a problem, I believe.
Yeah, I didn't say that flooding wouldn't be a problem. I said that the dam is not effective in controlling flooding. You could still have rain events and things like that that would cause flooding, but the presence or absence of the dam, because it is what's called run of the river, it doesn't actually hold back a body of water, wouldn't have an impact in that regard. And when you do have a dam that impounds water and doesn't have the ability for that impoundment to expand into adjacent wetlands, you still have the same problem, because then the water has to be released. My response to that is I do not believe that the Brunswick Dam would create a flood hazard. Removal of the Brunswick Dam would create any more flood hazard than already exists.
Great.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
Sure.
I believe before any dam was built there were 3 small waterfalls in Brunswick there. And so if you remove that dam, can you imagine seeing salmon jumping right in town there? I mean,
It'd be something to see.
Maybe there's only 9 of them, but it'd still be worth watching.
Great. Well, it's 8:27, so I want to let everybody get back to their evenings, but thank you all so much for this wonderful presentation. And as I'll get a recording up on our website, hopefully by the end of the week, and I'll put Charlie's contact info in. I'll have a brief summary of what's been shared, and I'll put Charlie's contact info in there. So if folks are interested in learning more about the dam relicensing in Brunswick and upstream, Charlie is your man.
If I don't know the answer, I know a few people who probably do. So I will continue to work on that. And we've got a heavy lift ahead to get to the right place, but this is a start.
Great. And next month, we're going to be learning about sturgeon, and a great question that I hope will be answered. I think I'm fairly confident it will be, is Why do sturgeon jump, and how would we know? So if you want answers to those questions, you can join us in May. So thanks everybody for showing up, and thank you all. There's some kudos in the chat for the three of you, and we'll hopefully see you next month. Thanks all.
Thank you.